Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, Jacob, over the weekend, and indeed during the few days before the weekend, there are massive stories about what the Prime Minister may do if he doesn't succeed in reaching a deal, nearly all of them contradicting all the others. So I'm going to start with the one fact I think we do know, which is if a deal isn't reached, he will, as required by the Ben Act, send a letter requesting an extension, won't he?
Well, I think you're being a bit of a gloomster, that there's a reasonable chance of a deal being reached, that is what the government's trying to do. It's absolutely fascinating how much support the proposed deal has received. That the Prime Minister's appearance in front of the House of Commons last Thursday seemed to be getting support from all sorts of corners, and the ERG seemed content, some Labour MPs seemed to be supporting it. It seems that our end of the conversation has been very successful, and that there is a proposal that could get through the House of Commons. And the question is, does the EU have any generosity of spirit? Is it willing to compromise, having completely won the first round with the previous government? Is it now willing to accept a deal that actually accepts the integrity of the United Kingdom and the right of a country to leave?
I'd be very surprised if, in answer to my first question, you didn't say there was a prospect of a deal, Jacob. But just picking up on that point, we're not in the tunnel, are we? It was hoped by this stage the talks would go into the tunnel, which is, the benefit of the listeners who don't follow the jargon. That's the stage you go into when the talks become very intense and near a conclusion. We're nowhere near there because it doesn't look as though, on the face of it, the Prime Minister's proposal is acceptable to the EU.
Well, in tunnel terms, I think we are between Chippenham and Bath Spa and waiting to go into the famous box tunnel, one of the great engineering feats of history. But there may be a donkey on the line, and we're waiting for the donkey to move off the line, at which point the train can go into the tunnel.
Let's just hope the tunnel and the donkey and the train don't all meet at the same point. But just assuming they don't, we don't have a deal, he will send this letter, won't he?
The Prime Minister will, of course, obey the law.
He said in court last week the position was that he would send the letter. That was the government's position, wasn't it?
The government's position is, as it's setting out to anybody who asks, that it will obey the law. I'm not a lawyer, and it is not therefore for me to set out precisely what the law means or requires. That will no doubt be done by the Attorney General and the law officers, who will advise the Prime Minister what he can do. And no doubt, if they don't do what other people want, there are some quite active legal minds in the United Kingdom who may conceivably take a case to the Supreme Court.
Okay. Well, the listeners must decide for themselves. I think you're going less far than the government did in court last week and reserving your options very carefully.
Well, the government must obey the law. The government always obeys the law. The rule of law is crucial, and the constitutional norms are a very important part of how we're governed. But if you look at the very interesting judgment from the Supreme Court on prorogation, the law is not simple. It's not always what you expect it to be, and sometimes there are developments in the law. So I'm saying the government will obey the law, but it's not necessarily entirely clear precisely what the law is.
Are you expecting the government to be back before the Supreme Court between now and the middle of October if a deal isn't reached?
Well, I think we're in such a litigious age that we're practically in front of the Supreme Court if the Prime Minister sneezes in the wrong way. And I think we've got to bear that in mind, that legal activism has become part of our constitution, actually, since we joined the European Union. It's one of the interesting things about our membership of the European Union, is that many things that weren't brought before the courts prior to 1972 now come before the courts. And I think there's an interesting discussion to be had on why that is, what led to it, And in my view, it is the bringing in of a rights-based civil code system on top of the common law, which changed the balance between the various parts of our constitutional setup.
What's the solution?
Well, I think the solution is leaving the European Union and taking out this idea of superior law that comes from outside the United Kingdom, because once there was superior law outside the United Kingdom, the Queen in Parliament ceased to be sovereign. Except in an absolute sense that it could take us out of the European Union. And once you had a situation where the European Court of Justice could strike down laws, then it followed that the British courts could strike down laws, power which they have used on a number of occasions. And that was not our normal constitutional understanding. Once we've left, the Queen in Parliament once again becomes the sovereign body on behalf of the people, and the power is brought back. It's the whole point about taking back control.
Would it really work like that? You're not going to comment on the Supreme Court case on prorogation, because I've tried you on that before and I know you won't. But once you create a Supreme Court, it's a very American type title, you take the judges out of the Lords, you create a potentially new way of doing things. Might the judges just do that anyway? In relation to the prorogation judgment, for example, they decided that Parliament, we've discussed this before, simply meant the legislature rather than the whole of Parliament, the Queen and the legislature and the executive in Parliament. I don't see any reason why that understanding should change just because we leave the EU.
One of the mistakes that seemed to me to be made by the Blair government was this desire to have separation of powers in the UK modelled on the separation of powers in the United States. That prior to the Blair reforms, everything took place in Parliament. That Parliament was the brackets around the Constitution, if you want to put it that way. So the courts were in Parliament, and the House of Lords was the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. The Queen and the Executive were part of Parliament, and the Legislature was part of Parliament. And that grew out of our history. It's obviously fascinating how the medieval Parliament works and how central the role of the King and the Executive is. It's interesting, why is there Standing Order 14 that gives the government control of the House of Commons? This goes back to the Elizabethan parliaments with the Privy Councillor sitting nearest to the Speaker and advising the Speaker on how to control business on behalf of the government. And that this mistaken idea of where the separation of powers should take us has unbalanced the Constitution. And the question is whether, once we've left the European Union, you can put that back or not. I don't have an answer, but I'd point listeners to a very good article by David Starkey in the Mail on Sunday, the Sunday before last, where he set out the options. And the options are that we either become more like the US, we go full steam ahead, or we look back to where we were essentially prior to 1972, but that the Blair reforms, what are they, 05, 06, that they move it further in a way that doesn't follow the history of the United Kingdom.
What's your instinct given those choices?
Well, I think ultimately it will depend on a general election and who wins. I think a Conservative desire would be to restore the very beautiful and successful constitution we had with its own internal balances. I imagine a socialist would prefer to smash everything up and start again, which is the usual socialist approach.
And just one more question about the bit of the EU debate. We probably can view a bit more closely because it's nearer home. Are you really confident these Labour MPs will come across and support a deal? Because only recently we had them forming this new group. It's called MPs for a Deal, isn't it? And indicating they wanted one. When the government actually produced one last week, my reading of it was you really couldn't see their heels for dust. They were distancing themselves very fast. So can you really rely on the votes of the opposition?
No wise government ever relies on the votes of the opposition. You sometimes find that they happen to be there, as Ted Heath did in 1971, when he began the process of passing the Act to take us into the European Union. And the decision Labour MPs will have to face is, do they want to leave at all? And there'll be those who think that by obstructing they will stop leaving. And if they do want to leave because they represent Leave seats, do they want to leave the deal? If this deal is the only deal available, is the choice then leaving on those terms or without a deal? And ultimately, they will make those choices looking at their electorates and thinking, can we be returned next time round? They will not be thinking, how do we help this wonderful Conservative government?
No, indeed. So it'll be tough from that point of view.
Yes, but if 70% of your electorate voted Leave, it's tough from the other point of view too.
Certainly. Do you really think, when you look around the Commons and reflect on the fact that there's a fixed term act, the election is not due until 2022, Prime Minister's tried twice to get one, he's not got the required 2/3. Do you really think there's a chance of getting the required 2/3? It looks like a difficult, distant prospect to me.
The Labour Party is currently languishing at about 20% in the opinion polls. I think what you're saying flows from that if the Labour Party were at 40% in the opinion polls, I think they might be voting for an election.
Since they're not 40% in the opinion polls, and they won't, without them, if the government moves a motion, can't really get its 2/3. So if they don't want an election, they can effectively stop the government having one.
Well, there may be other methods of getting an election, as you know. But the 2/3 seems a remote possibility at the moment. I accept that is true.
How do you get an election if you can't override fixed term by moving a motion yourself that requires the 2/3?
Well, if the Lib Dems wanted an election, there is probably a majority for the one-line Act of Parliament, which has been talked about. And we have offered the opportunity for the SNP to bring forward a vote of no confidence. And who knows how that would go.
But if you brought in the one-line Act, the one-line Act could be amended in any number of ways, and this Parliament's rather fond of amending things.
You would have the situation where if the one-line Act were to be amended, you wouldn't complete its stages.
Just moving to a completely different subject, I mean, off Europe and off Brexit, because the path is so unknown. What did you think about the report into the Carl Beach allegations and the police behaviour and the behaviour of Tom Watson?
Well, I think Tom Watson has very serious questions to answer because of the way he used parliamentary privilege and the pressure he put on the police to investigate allegations that turned out to be completely false. And this isn't easy for members of Parliament, that sometimes people come to you and say things and you don't know what the truth is and you feel obliged to take them to the appropriate authority. But it's unusual that you feel it's right to launch a campaign. And it seems to me that it was convenient for Tom Watson that it was Conservatives who were involved and that it made him a bit of a hero in the Labour Party. It raised his profile. And it was in the end thoroughly irresponsible against people who were innocent, believing the words of a fantasist. So I think his credibility is fundamentally undermined as a serious political thinker by what he has done. In terms of the broader allegations, my greatest sympathy and concern is for Harvey Proctor, that the way Lord Bramall and Lord Britton were both treated was absolutely appalling and disgraceful. But Harvey Proctor, it was worse for because he lost his job, he lost his home, and he had done absolutely nothing wrong. A fantasist had just alighted upon his name, and he had no network of supporters to fall back on. And most people thought Lord Bramall was a great hero and that these allegations were absolutely absurd, and that it was very unpleasant for him. He didn't lose his house or his job. For Harvey Proctor, I think it was a great personal strain and sadness for him, and that he deserves not only our great sympathy, but any support that can be given.
He had successfully rebuilt his life hadn't he, after earlier difficulty?
That's right. And the thing to bear in mind about the early difficulty is that related to things that would now not cause you any difficulty and would be perfectly legal. And he got into trouble because of the law as it was then, but isn't now. And therefore, I think he is the worst affected by this.
Are you suggesting Tom Watson very foolishly believed Carl Beech entirely and then acted inappropriately, or that there was an element of cynicism in what he did?
This is always a great question, isn't it? It's the knave or fool question. I tend to be charitable. I tend to think, by and large, in most circumstances, people are fools rather than knaves, but that they can sometimes be more foolish because there is a political benefit to it, and that encourages a lack of scepticism about things that they might otherwise have been concerned about.
Do you feel, as some people do, that he should leave public life?
Ultimately, it's a matter for electors, isn't it, whether they want to keep on voting for him, or the NEC, who might decide that he ought to be a woman. But, the Labour Party has its own ways of dealing with these things. I'm very cautious about calling for people to resign or retire from public life, that very often people call for this unduly quickly. And if voters in Wolverhampton seat, isn't it, wish to
West Bromwich.
West Bromwich want to carry on voting for him, that's up to them. But I wouldn't vote for him.
I think we can take that for granted. On a note that it sounds a bit parochial to people outside London, but I do think there's a non-London point to it. We've met while the Extinction Rebellion protests are going on this morning. I mean, just a first preliminary question about it. Some people have said, whether this kind of event takes place in London or elsewhere, why are the police allowing it all to happen? And roadworks to be clogged up and bridges to be closed and people are unable to get to work, and shouldn't they clear them all out?
I'm a great believer in freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and part of that is the right to protest. That is a completely legitimate part of a free society. And the police must facilitate freedom of expression. However, people must operate within the criminal law, and they mustn't cause criminal damage. They shouldn't be bringing fire engines in and squirting fake blood, even if they squirt it on themselves. The breaches of the law should be taken seriously, and the police should intervene when those happen.
Is the complaint precisely is the police are not always intervening when these breaches occur? Sometimes
it's a difficult balance, because sometimes the breaches are marginal to the protest, but the law must be upheld. This is very important, and people may carry out their protests within the law.
It's not a bigger question about all this. Are the Conservatives somehow losing the argument on climate change and the environment? I mean, look, one of Theresa May's last acts was to get through this measure whereby we're aiming for zero emissions by 2050, which is a very ambitious target. And yet it doesn't seem to me that the Conservatives get a great deal of credit for it. And that indeed, any time a move like this is made, the cry immediately goes up to do more, without anyone putting much of a countervailing argument.
Yet in Australia, when an electorate was faced with the chance of voting for a lower standard of living, it decided not to. And I think that's a very telling point. I don't think voters are going to vote for a lower standard of living. I think they are concerned about the environment, and they believe that things can be done that are technological improvements. And you look at the success of renewables, of solar panels and of offshore wind and so on, that actually is meaning that we can carry on using electricity, but it's coming from sources that pump out less carbon. So things can be done, and electric cars are becoming a reality, and that is less polluting than EU-approved diesel emissions, which choke us all off with nitrous oxides and particulates, where they fiddled the figures to help the German car industry. But leaving that to one side, electric cars are now coming, and therefore cleaner modes of transport taking place, but still people can do the journeys that they want to do. And that strikes me as being really important, that I'm with Matt Ridley on all of this, who I think explains very clearly how you can improve the environment whilst the economy grows and people are better off. I'm not a cave dweller, nor do I wish to be a cave dweller. And I think that approach to the environment is not one that will be electorally successful.
I wouldn't have thought Matt would approve of the zero target by 2050.
Perhaps you should do a Ridley cast and find out what his lordship's views are.
I'm just trying to find out whether you're in line with him on that view.
I'm supporting government policy loyally, as you know.
Do you think, that said, we're making quite enough of the sort of opportunity that Scott Morrison pursued in Australia, where he did exactly what you've described, and he struck, a distinctly more sceptical note about this than I've heard from some government ministers, frankly, where the tone has tended to be, we agree with you completely, we just can't go quite as fast as you'd like.
It's not so much a sceptical tone, it's recognising the political realities that are around this. There's somebody on the radio this morning who said we should eat 90% less meat. I have no intention of eating 90% less meat. I enjoy eating meat, and if I didn't eat the meat that I don't much like vegetables, there wouldn't be a lot left to eat, other than a bit of cheese, but I wouldn't be allowed that either. So I think we've got to go with the grain of what people want, and people want their standard of living to be a bit better than their parents, and their children have a better standard of living than they did, and that can be achieved, and the environment can be improved. And this is where Lord Ridley is so interesting, because he has explained the constant improvement of the environment as technology has got better and we've got richer. Things like the lower need to use marginal agricultural land, so the marginal agricultural land goes back to nature, and as it goes back to nature, wildlife is helped and you have more trees growing and so on and so forth. And that there is a positive evolution that goes along with economic growth that tends to be ignored, and I think that's a mistake.
Do you regret Rory Stewart leaving?
I'm a huge fan of Rory Stewart. I think he's very brilliant, interesting.
You've known him for a very long time.
I've known him for a very long time. We were at school together, and we were in the same house, and he's 5 years younger than I am, so he was entering the school as I was preparing to leave it, and he was strikingly brilliant and able from the day he arrived. And he's pot calling kettle black, really, but he is little changed from those days, probably almost as little as I am. And so I've always admired him and thought he was an asset to the Conservative Party. Rory is, however, and always has been, very impatient. He's always been somebody who wants to get on to the next thing, and that is very positive in some ways. But politics is perhaps a longer game than Rory thinks it is.
I think you're suggesting he might not be a team player.
Well, I wasn't really saying that. I'm saying that perhaps he gets bored easily.
Do you think he stands a chance?
Anyone.
Being elected as the independent mayor of London?
Anyone who throws his or her hat in the ring stands a chance. Some elections go in unexpected ways. But I don't think it's a huge chance, no. It's quite difficult to do these sorts of campaigns without a major political party behind you. And Ken Livingstone, though nominally an independent, de facto had a major political party behind him because nobody wanted to support Frank Dobson.
Of course, Rory will still be around to vote on the Queen's speech when the Queen's speech comes. Can you think of any occasion where a government's lost a Queen's speech and a general election has not followed?
There will be many occasions of that kind in the 19th century, up until Disraeli setting the precedent of resigning before meeting Parliament, because the routine was after an election to meet Parliament, lose the Queen's speech, and then resign. Since that convention changed, and Disraeli is the first one to go down that route, but then others go back to waiting, and I think you need to ask Vernon Bogdanor for the precise date, but it's around the 1890s that stops. Since then, No, of course not, because a Queen's speech being lost would have been a confidence issue, and the Prime Minister would have said, therefore, we must have an election, and would have asked for a dissolution. The Fixed Term Parliament Act changes all of that. It's one of the great flaws in the Fixed Term Parliament Act. It means you can have a government that has the nominal but not the real confidence of Parliament and has to carry on.
This is a very peculiar situation, isn't it? I mean, the Prime Minister, the government, you want a general election. Therefore, there's a case for arguing you might not be all that displeased if the Queen's speech, this flagship for your whole programme, actually fell, because under the normal rules that would have applied before the Fixed Term Act, you'd have got the general election you want.
I think opposition parties running away from a general election do themselves damage in the long term rather than helping themselves. They look at the polls and think, goodness, it's bad now. It will get worse if they run away from an election. The electorate wants an election, and the electorate aren't going to be fooled, and they know who's gumming the system up. It's not Boris Johnson who's gumming the system up.
What's your evidence for saying the electorate wants an election? I mean, traditionally, they hate them.
Well, the polls seem to have changed. That 3 months ago, the polls were quite clear that voters were all Brenda from Bristol, and now they're Boris from Bournemouth or wherever, and they want an election.
Well, you haven't denied there might be what would normally have been an upside for the government in losing the Queen's speech, but there you go.
No, I didn't. Sorry, I simply missed that. No, all governments always want to win the Queen's speech. It's not a good thing to lose the Queen's speech.
Do you think you will?
I don't know is the honest answer. I think it could potentially be a very close vote. I think we are probably at greatest risk to a clever amendment than we are to straight defeat on the Queen's speech.
Because the whip plus 21 ought, mostly anyway, to vote for the speech.
Some of them want the whip back, and that might be a way of indicating that they did want the whip back rather than that they wish to put themselves in permanent separation from the Conservative Party. But others have made it clear they want to put themselves into permanent separation from the Conservative Party.
I can just finish by just exploring this question of the general election again. I was trying to think my way through yesterday of getting to that magic number of, I think it's 433, the number you need to get the 2/3. It's not just Labour, is it? I mean, other than the Conservatives and I suppose the DUP, nearly everyone else, with a few exceptions, I mean, John Mann, who's going to the Lords, Ivan Lewis or Ian Austin, who voted for a general election last time round, nearly everyone's got an incentive not to do it. The Liberal Democrats have an incentive to vote for a general election, but equally, were there to be a mood in the Commons of pushing for a second referendum, they might go for that. Similarly, the SNP it might follow the same route. A lot of the independents, the Independent Group for Change, the whip plus 21, they've got no incentive to vote for a general election at all because that's the end of them.
The SNP and the Lib Dems have an interest in election. That is true. The SNP keep on saying it. And the Lib Dems appear to be doing well in the opinion polls. But your analysis is, as always, very acute. It's why people subscribe to Conservative Home.
Well, on that very flattering note,
we
will end. So others to say, as politicians say, it's a rather politician muck. But at any rate, thank you very much, and look forward to this again, if Extinction Rebellion allow us, in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.